Welcome to Phantom Astronaut. I'd like to thank all of the Phantom Astronaut patrons for supporting the show. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support the show, visit phantomastronaut.com for all the different ways that you can help us continue to create. Today we'll be discussing the industry of death with guest, Professor of Mortuary Science, Ben Schmidt. So, Ben, why don't you tell me, what is the field of mortuary science?
Okay, that's a pretty good question, actually, because it is one of the things that we have as funeral directors is we really have to be jack of all trades or Jill of all trades, depending. And so we have a lot of on the one side, what I will refer to as front of the house, right? That would be the people who are meeting with families. We need to have a certain level of grief counseling, psychology, sales, merchandise knowledge, an understanding of how our federal and local governments work, because we do have a lot of administrative jobs. And then there's a bunch of creativity that goes along with that, where it's like families are going to be looking for um, personalized services or to work in conjunction with that, whatever their religious point of view is, or something like that, right? But then on the back of the house, right? Those of us who are embalmers, right? I've done both. I'm licensed in Illinois, and we have a combined license. Not all states have that. Some have the funeral directing license separate from the embalming. So I've done plenty of both. But quite frankly, I am an embalmer at heart. And the reason why is because of all the science that goes along with it. So, as an embalmer, you need to understand chemistry, biology, anatomy, of course, and physics, actually, to a certain degree. And pathology is another thing that we study quite a bit too. So, that is mortuary science. It's kind of a little bit of all those little things that we put together, and that's what our role in society is.
It's very interesting. A couple of years ago, my family lost somebody, and at the expense of being a bit morbid, it was a bit of a panic. I got a telephone call, and I had to drive up from one neighborhood to the other neighborhood very quickly. And when I got here, this person had passed away. So, at that point, or a little bit before, I told the other person before I left, like, call 911, get somebody out here to, make to make sure that there's no way to to save this person, or whatever. And so by the time that I got up here, it was only a short wait before you had police come. And quickly after them, I'm guessing a mortician, or someone who assists a mortician came, and they came by themselves. And so I had to very carefully remove the jewelry from this person,
Sure.
and help to lift this person's body onto what looked to me to be a gurney. I don't know if that's still the proper term for it, but um it was unusual, because I don't want to get too much into, like I said, the tactile aspects of it, but
Yeah, sure. You shouldn't have to.
yeah, it didn't
I
feel
I see what you're going. It is unusual. Typically in cases like that, the coroners will handle that, or assisted
Mhm.
by the funeral directors. Like, generally, in cases such as that, you're not necessarily going to be called to do that as a family member. So I'm sorry if that was traumatic for you.
Oh, it wasn't so bad. I mean, it was in its own way, it was a little in its own way, it was a little comforting. It was a little bit it was a little nice. It had a there was a I think if more people participated more actively in the understanding, recognition, proximity to death, because death is a natural part of everyone's existence on Earth. I think if people had more confrontation with it, there'd probably be a little bit less fear of it. It's you know, it's a very, like you said, to many people it's traumatizing, but I think it also has the capacity to lend a bit of closure, right? And I think maybe some of that, it was illustrated back with the I mean, the tradition still persists, but it was more prevalent, you know, in the 19th and early 20th century of, you know, having the wake where the, you know, all the friends and family would, you know, sit with the deceased physically for a, you know, a very long period of time. And you know, I've been to a couple of funeral services, and you know, you pay your respects very quickly and kind of move on, and the physical aspect of it um is minimized. I don't know what your perspective is on that though.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with you. And what we have to remember is that culturally, um, in particular, Caucasian Christians are some of the ones that are the furthest removed from death, right? Because we have created in many ways this culture where, the funeral director shows up, we'll see a church. The church itself oftentimes designs the service, and the family is just kind of along for the ride, if that makes sense, right? But we've definitely seen a shift back in the other direction. We have a growth of home funerals, we have the green burial movement, and a lot of that stuff is incorporate or bringing back that sort of like hands-on experience, for lack of a better term. But I've had the privilege of taking part of many Hispanic families, and what you described happened to you during the body transfer. They'll do that stuff voluntarily. Actually, as their funeral director, you can almost expect it, right? Is if you arrive at the house that somebody is going to help you, and then on your way out, the family's going to interact with the person who had died. Hindu culture, actually, part of it, part of an important part of the ceremony is they are cremated at the end, and the family will actually start the crematory. So there are cultures out there that are still very hands-on with their loved ones, but it really is the white sort of Christian ideal to do this, because like a lot of the Hispanics were Catholic, right? But they still had a lot of that sort of just interaction with their loved one and the importance of doing that stuff. So yeah, but it's coming back. I think that and this is one of the reasons why I was willing to do your podcast, was I think that there's more information available to people outside of just what their funeral director will tell them. So then, as kind of a result of that, people watch YouTube videos, or they actually interact with the influencers in my community and things like that. And so they get their questions answered, and then they in turn bring that stuff to their funeral directors, or they can incorporate their own funeral. So, but that's what we as like the Gen Xers and millennials do, right? Like we want to be able to do something. That's how we operate. And so it's no surprise that funerals are now one of those things.
I recently discovered a profession. I'm not sure how prevalent it is in other areas, but I've started to see it pop up more here in the Los Angeles area. It's a job called death doula. Have you heard of this?
Oh yes, absolutely. And yes, you are right that the LA area is kind of the hotbed, or at least the West Coast, I would say, is the hotbed. But yeah, so as I understand it, it's kind of a informal training as of right now to sort of help people with their end of life, and their family with sort of transitioning to the funeral home. As near as I can tell, that's a loose description. I know that different organizations define it differently.
Well, I think the way that I would probably define it, and I haven't used one, I've just been fascinated by it because from my experiences of you know, losing people, the first time that you are confronted with the non-emotional, well, I don't want to say non-emotional, but I'll say the secular logistics of death, and you are the one who bears responsibility for performing them. I think it's a bit overwhelming. I think people understand the human aspect of death. We understand, the grief of losing someone, not being able to see them again. We don't really understand that death triggers an onerous legal process that must be
Yes.
dealt with while you are dealing with your emotional loss.
Right.
And I
Right.
think that the death doulas that I've seen advertised help you to help the living to prepare for making sure that they're not, or making sure they're leaving the minimum amount of loose ends for their loved ones when they pass. um I mean, how did it become that way, if you know the history of it? I mean, I can't imagine that there was this much red tape in 1900 around passing away.
Well, yeah, right. And that was kind of that front of the house stuff that I'm talking about, because your funeral director can actually help you think about a lot of this stuff too if you come in and make funeral arrangements beforehand, right? But yeah, so I mean, obviously, I guess as we grew to own more property, and then we have the entire bureaucracy of your state and federal governments. And then, we, like, as a society, just leave a bigger paper trail as we go. So we have all of these loose ends, and you're doing things all the time that are so organic with the administrative side of your life that you don't really realize it until after you're dead, right? I was thinking about this yesterday. I'm like, I think I got like a 401k with like $1,000 in it from a job I had 10 years ago. Like, I better like remember that or look into it and see. So um yeah, and you have to have death certificates for just about everything. But again, your funeral director can help you with that stuff. I mean, this is our job to figure out how to fill out the paperwork and do it correctly for you to make sure that you can claim any benefits that you might be needing and things like that. So,
Mhm. I think that the process of death also, especially if it's sudden or surprising, and I think many deaths probably are. I've known people who passed away who had, long fights with illness and things, and you have a long window to prepare. But I've also known people who passed away suddenly. Be that through suicide, or be that through some kind of series of unfortunate accidents that you know compound either into a medical or external sort of physical accident which ended their life. And this one person that we were talking about in the beginning, for example, they passed away suddenly, and they weren't in the best of health, but there wasn't anything that they were triaging on a regular basis, right? So it was just their heart gave out and they passed away. And one of the first things, we have those horrible phone calls you make, right? Where you're calling all these other relatives and you say, well, blah, blah, blah passed away. And, some of them, are very understanding. And then some of them go, well, what did the autopsy say that it was? What did the autopsy say? And then you have to politely explain, they don't really do an autopsy if it's not, if they're not
right.
suspecting
That's true.
any,
For your
you know?
listeners out there, most of the time when people die, there isn't an autopsy, right? There typically is something in someone's medical history that will describe their cause of death, right? Okay, well, they have a history of that kind of thing. Sorry, go on. But yeah, you're right about that.
Oh yeah. And I mean, I think that's kind of, part and parcel to that. So this idea that there's I think they get it, from watching television shows and things. They think that there's just always going to be an autopsy and there's always
Right.
going to be all this, treatment that happens that, you might see on an episode of CSI. But I mean, that's not, death is very common, and, it's just something that tends to happen. And on top of that, you just mentioned about the medical records, and let's say that somebody passes away and they haven't seen the doctor in 6, 7, 8 months. One thing that I learned is that if you don't have a designated primary care physician, like this example of this one person, they had been going to physical therapy because they had been in a car accident 2 or 3 years prior and were still recovering from that. But this person had not seen a primary care physician within that span of time. They'd been using telemedicine or other services. So without having that primary care physician in our local area, we did actually have to go through uh, a complicated process to verify the medical history of that individual, because they wouldn't take the physical therapist as a resident doctor and everything. So um how much of our funeral director was not particularly interactive. I'm not going to, you know, I don't know what's normal and what's not, but does a funeral director typically can they help you to navigate those sorts of situations too, or where do you find information if you can't get it from your funeral director?
So as far as trying to help you gather medical records,
Mm,
you know what, that really isn't part of our scope typically. I mean, what we can do is the most important job that we can do is support you during that time. So if you say,
mm,
well, I want to have this person cremated. Okay, well, we can't do anything about a cremation until the doctors have had their say, right? So that would be typically more um our end of the job. It's just to make sure that your person has a secure place that they're taken care of, and that
mm,
you're meeting, or that we're helping you to meet whatever ceremony. And then of course, um when and working with the medical staff as well, right? You know, because we do have to have on our death certificates, which you probably know, a doctor's signature and the cause of death and things like that. We are responsible for filtering those to make sure that those are acceptable. But as far as like helping people get their medical records, no, I quite frankly, if somebody asked me that like you just did, I'm not even sure where to start, you know. So but again, something to kind of keep in mind for all those people listening out there, it's good advice. Have yourself a point of contact. It
mm.
will make it a lot easier on your family when the time comes, if you do, unfortunately, for lack of a better term, die suddenly, which it does happen.
Yeah. Well, the whole process is very interesting to me. So when we went down to our funeral director, and this was another kind of a conflict that arose, and maybe this is a little bit more inside of your wheelhouse. And I'm sorry if I'm making this sound like it's, oh, this is a little bit of a therapy session, but it's interesting to me, and I'm curious about like a broad sense of what's expected, because people just don't know it.
That's
So
true. That's a
yeah,
great point. We're a good resource for a lot of things, but we can't do everything. That's for
right.
sure. Yeah.
So I went down to the funeral director. They asked us what kind of ceremony that we wanted, and we told them secular. And what that actually became a real point of contention between ourselves and the funeral home, because I guess there was some piece of documentation. I'm not sure if it was like an antiquated birth certificate or some other thing that they'd found that had listed that this particular person was Episcopalian. And I don't know how old that document was, but it certainly wasn't recent. And this person did not want to have a religious ceremony. So we had to fight tooth and nail, and we had to have a lawyer sign forms and things that uh and the funeral director was kind of begrudgingly do it. And we just got the sense through the whole thing that that the funeral director felt like we were trying to force something against the wishes of the deceased. And I'm not sure how often conflicts like that arise, if ever, in your experience, both teaching and in the professional world.
So there's plenty of conflicts amongst family members as far as what the ceremony is going to be like. But I'm honestly a little surprised that your funeral director would give you a hard time about what it was, because I mean, quite frankly, there's a lot of people who are lapsed whatevers, right? And it changes, end of life things. And then, the other thing is that funerals are actually for the living, not for the dead, right? Because you are the ones that are grieving. You want to be able to observe their life a certain way. And then, when you're a funeral director and you're working with a particular community, like Chicago obviously is like the largest Catholic community, and so did a lot of Catholic funerals. But a lot of times people would come in and say, we haven't been in church in years, we don't really know what to do, um, can you help us? I don't work for the Catholic Church, But it is my responsibility to say, if you are looking for traditional Catholic ceremonies, these are the guidelines. But I will do whatever it is that you would like to do in your version of that, right? So to have a funeral director be so adamant that, like, oh, we found this one thing that said that they were Episcopalian and we don't want to violate that. And, in particular, you can have something that's called a celebrant. And, their secular funerals are common, especially in California, where you can say to the celebrant, like, okay, well, if you want to add if we could add a little bit of religious stuff into it for the people in the audience. I mean, I was a celebrant for my own grandfather's funeral, and my dad said, make sure that you have a couple of Bible verses or whatever, because there are going to be some, more conservative people in the audience who need to hear that sort of thing. So, like, perfectly fine with that, So it's like a lot of funerals are adaptable. So I would say that I'm really surprised to hear that, like, the funeral director fought you so much on it. I mean, obviously, conflicting religions within a family is one thing, but like a funeral director is supposed to be impartial in that sense.
It's interesting. Well, he was a much older man. I don't know. Maybe he came from a different time. Again, I don't fault them. Maybe they were worried about liability or something, that maybe they thought
Could
another
be.
family member would sue them, or who knows. We're a very litigious society, so there could be a myriad of reasons.
That's
But
true.
you mentioned earlier that there's a wider array of um, I don't know what you call this. What do you call the difference with the category of, like, burial, cremation? What is there an industry term for
Uh,
those final
Disposition.
forms of
Yeah, disposition is what we call it. Yep.
disposition?
Yep.
So you'd mentioned earlier that there was an expanding array of disposition options.
Yes.
What are some of the ones that people may not be aware of?
Okay, that's a great question. And I would say there are two that are kind of like really at the growth where we're seeing a lot of growth, right? I'll talk about a third one that's actually one of the oldest ways we've ever done it as humans, but it's coming back in popularity, and that would be green burial. All right.
Mm.
But as far as new types of disposition, we have alkaline hydrolysis, which is actually legal, I think, in 35 states, but only about a dozen states have it available to them, right? I know it's not popular in California because it uses water. And with the whole like water shortage thing, like it's really not taking off right now, right? But here in Illinois, there's actually 3 or 4 different places that offer it, right? Because we have a giant lake that we can just grab water from. But essentially, what we have in alkaline hydrolysis is, you may hear it called flameless cremation, or also water cremation, or also resomation. Those are the kind of 3 terms for it. And essentially, what it is it's like an accelerated decomposition process. One of the most important things that drives a decomposition reaction is water. And so by adding a lot of water plus the alkalinity into it will drive the decomposition process. So essentially, what you have an accelerated decomposition process. In about a work day, a person is reduced to bones, and then they have to be processed and then returned to the family. It's actually cleaner. It's considered to be more environmentally friendly, the alkaline hydrolysis is. And then we have another one too that's happening, that's called natural organic reduction, also known as terramation. This is just recently legalized in California. It started really in the Pacific Northwest. There is a woman, her name is Katrina Spade, and she came up with this concept of, basically accelerated decomposition in dirt. So there are a couple of different versions of it. Herland Forest up in Washington State is one, and then we have my good friends, the Return Home NOR, Katie and Bree. And what they do is they put a person in what they call a mix, or for lack of a better term, of mix, and it has a lot of bacteria and other organic material in it, and essentially it gets everything all jazzed up and decomposes you faster. Now, I forget how long that process takes, but I know that it's like several weeks, because part of their services they offer is that you can actually like visit your loved one while they're in the vessel that they use for the decomposing. So it's kind of like a temporary grave, for lack of a better word. But then at the end, people get essentially their dirt of their person yet. People refer to it as human composting, but I don't really like that term. I prefer organic reduction or terramation are probably better for that. So those are kind of the two big ones that we see they're really taking off. In fact, natural organic reduction is on the bill here in Illinois. It's already passed in our state Senate and is up for vote in our state House. So I do believe that we will pass it. So yeah, those are kind of the new ones that are happening there. You see some fake ones on the internet, right? Like probably the biggest one is the tree pods. If anybody ever sees
I
these,
have seen that. I have seen that. That's a
so
fake
that,
one.
it's fake. Yes, it's actually was an art installation by a company called Capsula Mundi. Was how that got started, and they have urns and stuff for sale. But they, nobody is balling grandma up into underneath a tree, and not only that, but in that case, decomposition creates a lot of pH variance and heat. So there would be a lot of damage to a sapling at the bottom of a tree. Like it would even if you grow a tree over your loved one who is buried, like typically you have to wait like at least a year or so, maybe two, to the soil to even balance itself out to the point where a tree can grow again, because like it's so disruptive to the environment that like a little sapling would need. So that's fake one. And then maybe one of my other favorite ones that we've seen thanks to the AI is the woman encased in polyresin, right? So like, did you see that one before? It's like a
No, I
grandma
haven't.
encased in there. Yeah, they have like a fake, they say they turn their grandma into a coffee table and it's like half a grandma and she's like cooking it like I don't understand the stuff that people believe on the internet. Like nobody's cutting your grandma in half, none of that stuff. Um it wouldn't work out very well anyway if you were to.
I blame probably Damien Hirsch for that. Yeah, his sculptures with the the slices and things
Yeah,
that you
yeah,
know. I think that's probably plays a little bit. Pop culture, I'm sure, has always played an interesting complementary relationship um to your industry and to the way that we conceive of uh preserving our loved ones. I mean, there was a big thing in
sure.
the 90s about the cryogenics,
Oh yeah.
right? Which I think some people actually had it done. I can't imagine that they thought they would really be resurrected, but
So, okay, so I love the cryonics people, first of all. All right. I actually did a podcast. I have one of my own podcasts. It's called the Funeral Science Podcast, and I did an episode on cryonics. And those people are very transparent. The two that I talked to, there's one in Michigan and one in Arizona that are considered to be like the legit ones. Number one, the one in Michigan who does what they call perfusion, which is the basically embalming procedure with their preservative chemicals, is an embalmer. She is a licensed embalmer in Michigan and went to mortuary school. So it's like, yeah, here we go. Love that. And then the other thing is they tell you right up front, we don't know if this is going to work, right? So they're really not con artists at all. They just think this is the best way, that if we are going to be able to revive somebody, this is how it's going to have to work, because they have, cryonics with embryos and cryonics with organs. So they say, okay, well, this is what we can do for the full scale thing. So, but it's tough after you're dead, because you do start to decompose right away. So like if you're actually going to do the cryonic preservation, like you got to be pretty much on their table when you die, if it's even going to work effectively, to set you up for the future. So there's a lot of questions out there about that, but maybe the most famous person who's ever undergone cryonics was Ted Williams, and only his head was preserved. So
one thing that I just learned from you was the thing about the variance in the pH, and how it changes the soil composition, makes it somewhat inhospitable. So that really dispelled something that I think is very prevalent in storytelling. They did it in, uh, I think it was Casino. Remember, they dragged Joe Pesci out into the cornfield and
sure.
had them dig their graves. And I
Yeah.
think there was another thing. There was a Stephen King movie. It starred Johnny Depp. I forgot the name of it, but he got away with the murder by burying his wife and the lover in the garden and then planting corn over them.
Yeah,
And
the Secret Garden is the name of that.
yeah, the and like, and so basically what I know now is that if I go to somebody's house and I see a roughly human-sized patch of dead grass, I should be a bit suspicious.
Yeah, if it's not looking too healthy right there, then there's a good chance, right? That
So, how much do you know about the history of mortuary science, and when did this start to become something that was seriously studied? Because I know obviously everybody knows about the Egyptian pharaohs. We know about tombs of certain Roman emperors and things, but it didn't seem like it's something that the way that we think of having an end of life disposition doesn't seem like it's something that was within the reach of the common person for a very long time. And even when it became within the reach of the common person, I don't think that it was as well understood as you're obviously speaking of today. So walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. You got the right guy because I have taught funeral service history for the better part of a decade. All right. So what we got to take a look at first is that the embalming that Egyptians do and what we do today, or even the trajectory that kind of started it, are two completely different things, right? The Egyptians did spiritual embalmers. The embalmers that were the Egyptian embalmers were kind of, I'm going to say, pseudo slaves, or at least they were part of a religious cult whose main purpose was to preserve a body so the soul could complete a spiritual journey, right? And it was a lot of addition of salt. Actually, there's a guy, his name escapes me for the time being, but he actually did mummify somebody recently using all of the techniques that they use, only their tools and just a ton of salt. I forget what his number was like 200 pounds, right? So it's completely different. In fact, the French have a word for what we call, or what we do now is called thanopraxy. I actually prefer this because contemporary arterial embalming is completely different than Egyptian embalming, right? All right, so where did it come from? Well, it all kind of started out with in the around the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, right? We had this sort of explosion of scientific discovery because the veil, in many ways, by the church was lifted. So we had people like Leonardo da Vinci, for example. There's these guys called the Hunter brothers. A bunch of different. What they all ultimately were anatomists and or doctors that recognized that they needed to preserve their cadavers for better study. So what happened is when it came to the arterial injection, those were the guys who actually started embalming, was for the purpose of cadaver preservation. All right. Now keep in mind, as you already mentioned, for tens of thousands of years, humans have done their own religious ceremonies, right? So this is really where we get into contemporary funeral service. Now, fast forward to the Civil War era, all right? And we had a guy, his name was Colonel E. Ellsworth, and he was the first ranking casualty of the Civil War. And there was a guy, his name is Dr. Thomas Holmes. He's considered to be the father of American embalming, and probably, I would say, for funeral embalming in general. He embalmed Colonel Ellsworth and brought him to Washington, D.C., and put him on display for everybody who was interested: doctors, senators, representatives, and most importantly, Abraham Lincoln. All right. Abraham Lincoln was probably one of the biggest proponents of embalming. In fact, he had his sons embalmed, right? He had his son embalmed. And then, of course, Abraham Lincoln himself was embalmed. And he was shown that he made like 18 stops between Washington, D.C. and Springfield, where he's buried. And, I forget what the exact number is, but if to say it's 2 million people, like that's probably not way off, that actually saw him embalmed. And that created the spread of embalming in the United States. But to that point, it was only doctors that were doing it, right? Is because a lot of the embalming came from these doctors who were battlefield surgeons that would also offer embalming as one of their services to the soldiers. So you would kind of see, the people in the South didn't really do it that much because they were basically fighting the war in their own backyard. They didn't need this service. But if you were somebody who like died in North Carolina and you were going back to Maine, well, you wanted to have your body shipped home, and some of that embalming things were done in order to allow uniform train shipping and like a bunch of other stuff. But that's kind of how it proliferated. Now, for the actual study itself, right, the people who taught embalming to other embalmers at the time were chemical fluid salespeople. So they would travel around and they would say, okay, well, I have these caskets, maybe. Depending on where you were, maybe your local cabinet maker did your caskets. And so they would teach them embalming, and they would explain to them how to do it, and then they would demonstrate it if they could, and that's kind of how it proliferated. And then the schools kind of just started doing it. Like the college that I went to originated from a guy named Carl Barnes, and it was Carl Barnes School of Anatomy, and it was literally an embalming school, and people would come for 6 weeks for a clinic, and they would learn how to do all these different techniques. And there was a lot of people through history during that time that were doing restorative art techniques and that were doing all that stuff. So slowly but surely, the chemical companies started opening schools. Eventually, it was also picked up by public schools to be able to offer it as like an associate's degree, which is what most schools offer it as now. And so that's how it became mortuary science, so to speak, was that we put all under one roof, all the embalming, the restorative art, and all the funeral directing stuff, the merchandising, things like that, and brought it all together under one discipline, I guess you could call it.
Interesting. Something that makes me think of is, and I have no clue about the answer to this question. I don't even have a guess. So this is going to be really informative information, I think, for the audience as well. Everything eventually decays. And when we talk about the preservation methods and chemicals and things that are involved in it, combined with the construction of something like a casket, I think there's a pleasant thing where people see the casket go in the ground and gets covered and people visit the burial site. Realistically speaking, though, if you don't mind answering this, how long does that state really last?
So that is a really tough thing to answer because we have all sorts of incidences through like modern contemporary embalming, for example, where people are disinterred, right, to be moved or whatever, and they're still in really good shape, having been embalmed 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, 40 years earlier, and stuff like that. So I don't know, but you are right. Everything decomposes. It is the way of nature, right? So eventually all of those things will break down, just slower. And again, like you mentioned, the casket, it depends on what the casket material is. A metal casket's going to decompose slower than a wood one would. One thing that people don't always know about either is a lot of times in your cemeteries and memorial parks, they require what's called a vault, which is an outer burial container, and essentially its purpose is to maintain the integrity of the grave itself. That's why you don't look at cemeteries and see like the ground is all like messed up and stuff from the cave in of the dirt underneath there. So it creates a uniformity. And of course, that's going to contribute to the longevity of the person inside. But if we're talking about something like green burial or whatever, that would be a normal decomposition rate. But that again is going to change based on water content of the person, the water content around them, and that kind of thing. So it's variance, that's for sure.
Hmm. And connected to that in a little bit more of a mythological way, I'm sure that you've had conversations about this in the past between other people involved in mortuary science, but there's a history not just in the Catholic Church, but also in secular traditions and and other places of what's called incorruptibility,
Uh-huh.
where these saints or whatever, they've been they defy decomposition. And I think this also was true, at least for a time, of Lenin's uh, body and the former Soviet Union. They had a mythology about that Lenin's body was not decomposing, so it was somewhat incorruptible, even though that wasn't a Catholic based thing. What do you think? What circumstances scientifically do you think create that? Ignoring the spiritual aspect, we're not even going to touch the spiritual aspect.
Okay, so a couple of things there. Again, listen to my podcast, the Funeral Science Podcast. I did one on Lenin. Number one, Lenin is embalmed, right? There is a very specific mix that they talked about. There's a good book called the Lenin's Embalmers, and one of the authors is his dad was one of the original embalmers, and then he kind of took over for him because he kind of grew up embalming Lenin over and over again. It's really kind of an interesting story. But yes, and if you really want to get frustrated with government bureaucracy, that's the book for you, right? So essentially, he's not incorruptible. He's actually quite corrupt when it comes to his body. Now, as far as the incorruptible that we have, like, of the for canonization of saints, sorry, again, podcast episode, I recently did one over Sister Mary Wilhelmina Lancaster, the woman that they disinterred in Missouri and is considered to be quote unquote incorrupt, right? But here's what I want people to remember, is that dry arid conditions generally will result in what we think of as incorruptible, right? Because what's important, and this is why the Egyptians use so much salt, is water. All right. Water, when water comes into contact with basically every chemical, carbohydrate, proteins, lipids, it destroys it. This is a process called hydrolysis. It is the driving engine of decomposition. So anytime we have a lack of water, we are going to have a better preservation. Sister Wilhelmina, if I remember correctly, was like a person who died very slowly on hospice. When people are on hospice, that is the end of life care. They are generally purposely dehydrated. So this woman probably already died with a little bit less of water in her body and then preserved it. And on top of that, just because somebody isn't green, bloated, and melting away from their skeleton does not mean that they are incorrupt, right? To me, this is also a form of decomposition. It's just not as fast. So it's pretty much impossible for somebody to be incorrupt unless they have been, put under certain specific instances. And while I was looking at Sister Wilhelmina story, it turns out that a lot of the instances that they were calling people incorrupt were actually fabrications by the church to get someone canonized, or there was other things that were involved in there. Sister Wilhelmina, I do believe, by looking at her pictures, that she's been cosmetized for viewing of the public. There's all sorts of things. Even if they say that she's not embalmed, it's very possible that her body is in really pretty good condition, right? Because we have a lot of instances of natural mummification. So to me, that would be kind of where that quote unquote incorruptible. It's just not corrupt as bad as the rest of us when it comes down to, as near as I can tell.
That leads me to another thing that goes a little bit more into the esoteric, but I think has a scientific basis. I was in Bulgaria, the Black Sea, probably about 10 years ago. And they had recently, I don't know if they were doing construction or an excavation for some, archaeological purpose, but they discovered what are colloquially a vampire graveyard, right? Where they have the bricks in the mouth and stakes through the chest and things like
Sure.
that that
Yep.
are part of some Eastern European mythologies and practices regarding that. Now, obviously, since this was a burial site, the people that participated in that community they know what death looks like because they deal with it. There must have been, maybe 100, 200 people uh, for every one of these vampires. What scientifically could lead a people who have a normal burial practice to believe that something unearthly like vampirism was affecting a corpse?
Yeah, I don't know, other than rumors, that kind of thing. I mean, it's kind of the same thing as the Salem witch trials, like
Mm.
just kind of religious fervor of somebody. In my opinion, it just is simply somebody was like, okay, we heard a rumor. Because as far as I understand, some of those vampire cemeteries, people are actually disinterred and then those things done to them,
Mm.
right? So that would, to me, that would be the description I,
So
would
you
come.
feel there's more of because one camp says that there are certain aspects of decomposition that lead certain things to be more pronounced, like the way that skin retracts and things, but you think it's more of a social component.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100%, because here's the thing that people cannot quantify locally, and that is the rates of decomposition, right? Seriously, it's impossible to track it. We have universities that are doing this under certain conditions all the time, and even there's so many variances because everybody's death is different. Our chemical makeup is different, the conditions are different, so to be able to say, well, this person looks like they might be a vampire, like, I don't know, it's impossible to tell because decomposition varies so much. Even when we teach it, we're like, here are all these different things. And people, like, even now, you may have a faster decomposition because of the medical treatment you were receiving, right? So all these different things contribute to the way that we look when we die.
Interesting. So, I mean, what drew you into this as a profession? I'm not going to say that it's unusual. Obviously, it's a necessary and long part of many communities, but I think that a lot of people have a natural aversion to that proximity to death. Um, what what drew you into it?
Yeah, you know what? It's weird. 'Cause, like, a lot of times when people ask this question, I was called to it, or I've always been interested into it, but that's
Mm.
really not the case with me. So I was in the Navy, and during that time, I was working to a dual bachelor's degree, one in psychology and one in natural science and mathematics. When I completed that, what I wanted to do was become a science teacher. But it was 2008. It wasn't really like there wasn't a lot of going ons with schools and hiring like that, so it wasn't necessarily the best trajectory for me at the time. What I was doing is that I was working as a case manager for children with handicaps, right? Autistic kids, developmental disorders, that kind of thing. And I was like, man, this is a lot. Let me find a job that's a lot easier. And so actually, like, a lot of times people are like, you should do this. You should be a funeral director. You seem to have a lot of the interests that funeral directors have. Now, I don't consider myself a morbid person or that kind of thing. Obviously, you can see me, your listeners can't, but I'm not surrounded by a bunch of like goth looking stuff or whatever, I've been pretty serious on this podcast, but I'm actually pretty goofy if people ever go to find me. But uh so I started kind of looking around at different options as far as what I could do. I looked at optometry school, I looked at law school, but one of the places that I looked at was there is a college here in Chicago. It's 110 years old. It's called Worsham College of Mortuary Science. It's one of the most renowned schools in the world. For some funeral directors in other countries, it's literally a tourist destination, right? I have a very good friend who's from Belgium who like came and visited me at work and was like, "Wow, you work here?" Um, but to me, it's just a building in Wheeling, Illinois. So I went to school there, and when I graduated, I um, went to work at a really busy funeral home. I was able to service the funeral home is in a city called Elgin, Illinois. They call it the city in the suburbs. It's like one of the top 5 most populous cities in Illinois. And they were the biggest funeral home there. So I was able to serve populations of all kinds, right? So I learned a lot there, but I was also got a master's degree. And when I finished it, I went back and I taught at Worsham. I don't teach there anymore, but I am a professor of mortuary science now at Northeast Texas Community College. And so that's kind of my trajectory in this. It all started out with me wanting to be a science educator, and I am a science teacher now of some very specific sciences, you know.
So I think if you were going to ask someone, I think if you were going to speak with somebody who wants to become a funeral director, mortician, enter the field, two things that stood out to me from what you just said are probably a good deal of empathy. I think you have to be, from this conversation, an empathic person, somebody who can place themselves in the perspective of others during a very complicated time, and also somebody who has a firm, rational mind, who gets excited about the STEM aspects of what's happening, and always continuing to want to improve and learn, and figure out the physical sciences of the industry. Is that accurate, do you think?
Yeah, you can kind of sum it up in one term. This is what I usually say when somebody wants to get into it. I tell them you have to have a good imagination, right?
Mhm.
Because you have, like as you mentioned, you have to be able to describe to families what their service is going to look like. You are guidance. I mean, it's tough. You don't want to be somebody who's like an empath where that's like a serious thing for you too much, because there's something that we call compassion fatigue, where if
Mhm.
you keep taking on too much of other people's problems, like believe me, in the funeral industry, yes, a lot of old people die, but there's a lot of like difficult deaths to deal with and families who are having a hard time. So if you find yourself as a person who's like, well, I just want to be empathic with people, like you might be headed to like damaging yourself. And then the other part of the imagination is that you are tasked with learning anatomy, chemistry, biology, physics, pathology, and all that other stuff. And for a lot of people, especially since the degree is a 2-year degree, they don't have a background in any of those things. They take the ones that we give them, and maybe sometimes at the colleges there's some prereqs, but you have to be able to understand those things in a context that makes sense for yourself. My podcast that I mentioned, I have a Instagram page that people follow and enjoy. Really what it is an insight into my own imagination. And that's what I try to do as a teacher is like, here's how I imagine it, but like you need your own imagination too. Don't just go by what I say, because that will make you a better funeral director and a better embalmer if you can use your imagination in those ways.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Where can people find that podcast and Instagram page? What are all the different handles that we can look you up
Okay,
under?
so I have a long list of things that I do in funeral services. I already mentioned I'm a professor at Northeast Texas Community College. This school is totally online. You have a requirement for clinicals, but it is a state school. So if you are looking at an online school that may be affordable to you, we are available in all 50 states. All right. I'm also a consultant for Frigid Fluid Company, which is probably, I would say, the most high profile on social media. So you can find us at Frigid Fluid on Instagram, Twitter. There's a Facebook page of Frigid Fluid. I personally host the Funeral Science podcast. You can get that wherever you get your podcast. That's kind of a short form podcast where I look at a couple of different aspects and then do a scripted review of what it is, what my research has shown. And then for Frigid Fluid, one of my primary duties is I am the host of the Funeral Cast. And so that also has its own Instagram page and Facebook page. Oh, I should note that the Funeral Science podcast has its own Facebook page also. Um, so you can find me there. You can listen to the Funeral Cast. That one's a little bit different. It's more of an interview thing, where I get my friends and other people that I know that are in funeral service, and we look at some pop culture and topics and things like that that are related to funeral service. So you kind of see those things through our eyes. My Instagram page is Mort Tracker. That's MORTRAQR. And that is the name of an app that I co-created for mortuary science students. So I'm kind of all over whenever people ask me, like, where can we find you? Like, if you look up Ben Schmidt Funeral Service, like, you're going to find me. I'm pretty visible when it comes to that kind of stuff. And, I run with a crew of educational funeral directors as well. So if you're interested in that, some other people that I would support for sure, if you are interested in knowing more about funeral service, Carrie Northey or Carrie the Mortician on YouTube is a good source. And then if you are looking for a podcast that's not mine, but I would recommend mine first, is Undertaking the Podcast. These guys were probably I would say they were the first podcast for funeral directors that was kind of a social podcast. It wasn't centered on necessarily around business or anything, but a lot of like non-funeral directors listen to them and things like that. So that would be kind of the other content that I would put out there as my if you're looking for more funeral service information type people.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's been fascinating. I really appreciate the time.
You're welcome.
Visit phantomastronaut.com for all of the different ways that you can help us to continue to create. And I will see you out there.